Welcome to this PDS Overview session. We'll speak in this session about an introduction of PDS, what it is, its main functionalities. Then we'll go on to the workflow, how it works and how it integrates with different products. We will then go on to different authentication methods possible in PDS, and we'll finally speak about options of customization of PDS. First of all, it is important to understand that PDS serves as a gatekeeper to all of our products. When a user tries to access one of our products or one of our applications, we need to have a system that identifies the user and that knows if the user already logged in or not. So the first question that PDS asks the user, which is basically that single sign-on mechanism, whenever a user accesses one of our applications, PDS asks, have you ever been here before? What does it mean? It means that if the user already signed in from a different system or from a different Ex Libris application, it shouldn't have to sign in again. But if the user did not sign in yet, PDS will ask them if they are even allowed to enter, which is basically the authentication. PDS is able to perform authentication via different systems. We'll speak about that later. And then finally, after the user already performed the authentication, PDS retrieves some more information about the user, such as their name, their email address if required, which group they are, and so on. And PDS is able to send this information to the application that requested the authentication of this user. PDS stands for Patron Directory Services. It is a standalone component that comes as part of the installation of some of the Ex Libris products, most of them actually, all of those that require authentication. It is redirected from other applications. It means that PDS is basically a standalone component, which means it has its own URL or an address, and if an application wants to use PDS, it needs to know to redirect to the PDS address. PDS will then perform its actions, single sign-on or login, and it will redirect back to the application that requested the authentication or the service from PDS. PDS can basically stand on its own, which means we can access the PDS URL and we can perform authentication. But of course, it doesn't really have a meaning unless an actual application wants to perform the authentication. PDS has two main functionalities. One is the login service, which includes both the authentication, the actual, when a user enters username and password, and also the bore info part, which is retrieving after the user authenticated, PDS knows to retrieve some more information about the user to then be sent to the application. The second main functionality of PDS is single sign-on, which means that PDS knows to save a session of a user that already logged in, and then if the cookie exists in the browser, PDS will not require the same user to log in again to a different application. The single sign-on can be between Ex Libris applications, or it can be between Ex Libris applications and other systems of the library which aren't specifically Ex Libris applications. PDS runs as a Perl module of Apache, which means that if Apache is running, then PDS can also run. The URL of PDS is the URL of Apache/PDS. All the PDS files are usually under the /PDS directory, and there is an alias to access this directory, which is PDS root. You can also see here the different log files. The main log file of PDS is the PDS_server.log, which is under the logdir directory. the Apache logs can also be useful, and PDS log can be set to debug on or debug off using the PDS debug on or PDS debug off command that can be run from the PDS program directory. All this information is in this slide, so you can review it later if required. As we said previously, PDS comes with the installation of the product. However, since all different applications should use the same PDS in order to enable single sign-on, it's not required that the PDS installed on that product is used. For instance, if we have Aleph and Primo, Aleph comes with its own PDS and Primo comes with its own PDS as well. However, we only need to use a single PDS instance. So maybe we can use the one on Primo, and then Aleph would redirect to the PDS instance on Primo. That means that the PDS instance on Aleph is not actually used. The service spec of PDS is included in the product's service spec, which means that if we use the PDS on the Primo server, then when Primo version is updated, the PDS version may also be updated then. As we said, same PDS instance will be usually used for multiple products. And because PDS is a standalone component which has an URL, each application can define their PDS URL. And if different applications define the same PDS URL, they can have single sign-on between them. And this PDS URL that is defined in the application is the one used for all of the redirections of that application to PDS and back. In each application, we can define two PDS URLs. One, the main PDS URL parameter, is used for the URL that will be used to the end user, the one that the end user will see in their browser, and it will be used for all browser redirections. And also, we can define in each application the PDS internal URL, or maybe PDS URL in, which is used for server-to-server calls. This URL will not be displayed in the browser, but it will be called from server-to-server calls. For instance, if the application calls PDS from within the server, it will use the internal URL. It could be useful for different network configuration, in case the external URL is different from the internal one. Most of the cases, the PDS URL is equal to the internal URL, but it's important to understand that we can configure a different internal URL in case that we have a different network infrastructure that does not allow us to access the regular URL from within the server. The command ver on each one of our applications can also show the PDS version used in that installation. Okay, so let's see the workflow, the general workflow of PDS. It starts with the user accessing the main Ex Libris application. For instance, it accesses Primo. And then Primo wants to know if that user, it wants to see if that user already logged in order to retrieve information about the user. So then this application Primo in this case, will redirect PDS to an SSO call, which means that in the browser, Primo will redirect to /PDS with function equals SSO. If you turn on Firebug or a similar tool, you will be able to see this SSO URL in that tool. After PDS was asked for an SSO call, PDS checks if it has a cookie. Okay, if the user already logged in from a different application, for instance from Aleph or even from within the library. If the user already exists and PDS finds that the user has already previously logged in, PDS will redirect back to the application that called it, in this case Primo, and it will send it a PDS handle parameter. The PDS handle is an identifier of of some characters, and this identifier tells the application that the user is logged in and that they need to retrieve the information. When the application receives the PDS handle, which is basically the key of that user, it creates a server-to-server call to PDS, which is a call we won't see in the browser. We will, however, see it on the server in the log files. It asks for PDS to give it information about the user with this specific key. Then PDS will send Primo or the application the information about the user, and this information can be used by the application for different purposes. For instance, the name will be retrieved in the bore info call, and then Primo will be able to display the name of the user in its front end. This was the case of a successful SSO, which means PDS found that the user is logged in, and then it gives Primo information, or the other Ex Libris application information about the user that already performed sign-in, and the sign-in page is not displayed again for the user. In case the user never logged in before, PDS will redirect back to the application with the parameter PDS handle equals guest. Guest means that the user never logged in, and the application should display it as a guest user and not allow a different options of a signed-in user. But then when the user does request for sign-in, they need to click the sign-in button, and then the sign-in button will redirect to PDS and request PDS to perform login. PDS will then display the login page. It will be either a PDS login page or an external login page, but once the user logs in, PDS retrieves its information and does the same PDS handle parameter, sends it back to the application, and then the application requests the borrow information from PDS using that PDS handle, and then the application knows that the user signed in and can display the different parameters of that user. This is the general workflow, and the main identifier of the session is the PDS handle, which is transferred between PDS and the application for PDS to notify the application that there is a successful login of a user. We can see the workflow here as well. We can see that the user accesses the Ex Libris product, which then first checks for single sign-on, and then performs login, retrieval of borrower information, and of course there is the logout in the end. When a user requests to log out, again the application must redirect to PDS for PDS to clear the cookie and clear the session, and then PDS can redirect back to the application as a guest because the user logged out. Now we'll start talking about the different authentication methods PDS can offer. The first authentication, or the first group of authentication methods, is called Authenticate, and it's configured as Authenticate in PDS. And this is the basic method of authentication within PDS. This method says that PDS displays login page from its own HTML files, which means when we click sign on, the user is redirected to PDS and remains in the PDS login page. And then PDS performs the authentication via an API or a protocol. For instance, it can call a sign-on API from one of the Ex Libris applications. If a user is in Alma, then PDS can call an API to Alma, requesting Alma to authenticate the user. This is one example. Another example is using the LDAP API protocol. We'll speak about that some more soon. Another option can be a CGI hook, which means that a customer can develop their own CGI script, and then PDS can know to request information from this script and receive back information about the user, or if they can authenticate or not. In this possibility, we can also chain different authentication methods, which means we can first check if the user is able to log in via Alma, and then if not, we can check this user in LDAP. So we can use different authentication methods as a chain. The application, some of the Ex Libris applications store user database. So we can configure PDS to request authentication from one of these applications via their user database by defining the relevant API program of that product. For instance, Alma uses the DPSPL program. The DPSPL program knows to build the required API for requesting authentication from Alma. And then when PDS is using DPSPL with the correct Alma attributes, PDS knows to send Alma the API and then retrieve back the user information. The authentication in this case is done from server to server, from the PDS server to the Alma server to the Aleph server to the any application or to the LDAP server even. Therefore, we must make sure that the PDS server IP is allowed to access that external application's IP or the API even. So therefore, we must either configure LDAP to allow the PDS IP address or Alma or Aleph and so on. If the IP is not allowed, we will usually receive either a timeout if it's blocked in the firewall, or we can receive an actual error message in the log saying your IP is not allowed to access. LDAP is also an application that can store different user information. PDS can use the protocol, the LDAP protocol, to authenticate with users that are stored in the customer's Active Directory or LDAP server. The parameters for configuring the LDAP should be provided by the customer. More about LDAP and troubleshooting LDAP issues will be available in the PDS Troubleshooter document. The second option of configuring PDS authentication is via the load login method. In the load login method, PDS only serves as a gateway. The PDS login page is not displayed, but rather PDS redirects to an external login page or to an external application. This method is usually used because libraries want their users to authenticate in a central authentication system that the library already has, and other library applications also connect to that central authentication system. For instance, it can use Shibboleth, it can use CAS, iChain, or even remote login. All of these are basically central authentication systems used by our users, and PDS knows to redirect to these external systems and communicate with them in different methods. These external systems are the ones performing the actual authentication. The user and password is entered to these external systems, and we don't have the login page. It's not using the PDS login page, and therefore we don't ever receive the username and password of the library's users. They are all entered to external systems, and these external systems can give PDS back information about the user that logged in. A valid ID, for instance, and so on. In the remote authentication, the authentication is not performed by PDS. PDS only redirects to a remote login page. It's a send-away service that basically PDS only sends away the authentication request to an external system. The remote page is the central authentication service of the institute, and after the user is authenticated, the system knows to reply back to PDS. The options can be different. One is a generic remote login, any page that the customer built, but then the customer must develop their page to know to send back PDS a response with the relevant user information. Other widely used central authentication systems are CAS or Shibboleth that can also integrate with PDS, and PDS knows to send the authentication request to them, and they know to send back the information to PDS. So the workflow with external systems is very similar to what we've seen before. First, we have the SSO, and then in the SSO, PDS can also check with an external system if the user ever signed into an external system. And if they did, PDS creates a cookie and sends back to the application as a logged in user. If the user did not log in, then we have the load login option, which then the PDS sends the user to an external login page. And then once the external login page replied to PDS, we have the BOR info section, which is also very similar to what we've seen before, that PDS can request information from different systems about the user. Let's speak some more about BOR info. BOR info is a different process than load login. Load login, for instance, can be via Shibboleth, but then the user attributes are retrieved from Alma. Shibboleth only performs the authentication and gives us the ID of the user, but then the name and email address and all that can come from Alma. PDS can retrieve user attributes via an API or any protocol. It could be, as we said, via an Ex Libris application, Alma, Aleph, and so on, or via external resources such as LDAP or Shibboleth. It is done after the sign-in or the authentication process. And then once the applications request the borrow information, they need to send the handle that they received from PDS back to PDS, requesting information about the user, and then PDS can send back the information it retrieved from external systems. The call is called BOR info, and it's a call that is performed server to server, which means the Ex Libris application requests PDS server to server the information, and then PDS sends back this information to the application for it to use the different attributes of the user. Now we'll speak briefly about customization. PDS has different HTML files. These HTML files are displayed to the user or used for redirections. If we have different institutes on the server, we can use different HTML files for each institute. So first we have the global HTML files, which are the default ones. We can configure HTML file by calling system, which means by the application that requests the information. It is less used, but what is more used is the institution level. We can have different HTML files for different institutions. For instance, if we want to display a different login page for each institution, we can configure HTML files in institution level and then put in the login page of each institution in their corresponding directory. This is it for the overview of PDS. Thank you for listening.